The night Alfred Winslow heard that Mamie Fairchild was to be married off by morning, he did not stop to think. He saddled his horse, kicked his heels into its flanks, and rode hard into the dark Texas sky. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Dustcreek sat wedged between two low hills in the heart of West Texas like a splinter that the land had never quite managed to work free. The town had a main street of sun-bleached storefronts, a livery stable that smelled powerfully of horses and hay, a saloon called the Red Spur that did a brisk business on Friday nights, and a church with a leaning steeple that nobody had gotten around to straightening in 3 years. Dustcreek was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's affairs, and very little stayed private for longer than a Sunday afternoon. Alfred Winslow had been riding for the Cowboy ranch since he was 19 years old. He was 26 now, broad-shouldered and lean, with calloused hands that had mended more fence posts than he cared to count, and eyes the color of creek water in November. A pale, serious gray that could go soft when he was thinking about something he loved. He was not a man who talked a great deal. When he spoke, people tended to listen, because he spent his words carefully, the way a man in dry country spends his water. He wore a battered brown hat that had been through 2 droughts and 1 river crossing, and he kept his dark hair cut close under it. He was not the kind of man who walked into a room and made noise about himself, but he was the kind of man that a room felt differently when he left. He had known Mamie Fairchild for 2 years, and for most of those 2 years he had done a quiet, thorough job of pretending he did not feel the way he did about her. Mamie had come to Dustcreek with her father, Ezra Fairchild, when the old man's health had pushed him out of his cattle operation in Abilene and forced a quieter life on him. She was 22, with dark red hair that she wore pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat when she was working and loose around her shoulders on the rare evenings she had to herself. She had a straight, honest gaze and a laugh that arrived unexpectedly and lit up whatever room it happened in. She read books that she ordered from a catalog and kept stacked on the windowsill of her bedroom, and she could discuss the price of beef cattle and the novels of Bret Harte with equal fluency. She helped her father manage what was left of their small herd, and she took no nonsense from anyone, not from the men at the feed store who talked over her head to her father, and not from the women at the church who suggested that a girl of her age ought to be more focused on finding a husband. Alfred had met her at the Callaway barn dance in the autumn of 1876. She had been standing near the door with a glass of lemonade, watching the dancing with an expression of polite amusement, and when he had accidentally walked into the doorframe because he was looking at her instead of where he was going, she had laughed, that unexpected, brilliant laugh, and he had been completely undone from that moment forward. They had become friends the way that was natural between 2 people who were both somewhat private and both somewhat stubborn. They talked horses, they talked weather, they talked about whether Dustcreek would ever get a proper school, or whether the children of the county would go on being educated in the back of the general store by a rotating roster of barely qualified tutors. He had ridden her fences twice when her father was too ill to do it, and she had brought a pot of soup to the bunkhouse once when half the Callaway crew went down with a fever, and she had sat at the end of his cot and talked to him about a book she was reading until his head stopped pounding, and he fell asleep with the sound of her voice still in the room. He had never told her how he felt. He was not sure he had the right. She was educated and capable and ambitious for a life that might take her somewhere better than a cattle ranch in West Texas, and he was a working cowboy whose worldly possessions amounted to a good horse, a reliable rifle, a worn saddle, and a modest amount of saved wages kept in a tin box under his bunk. He had told himself he would save enough money first. He had told himself he would wait until he had something real to offer. He had told himself a great many things that kept him honest and kept him quiet, and meanwhile Mamie Fairchild had gone on being the clearest, truest thing in his world. He had been in town 2 days ago when he had heard Ezra Fairchild was in bad shape. Not the ordinary bad shape of an aging man with a weak chest, but the desperate kind, the kind that came with debt. The Fairchild land, it turned out, had been mortgaged against a loan that Ezra had taken the previous winter to keep his remaining cattle through a hard freeze, and the man who held that note was Cornelius Holt. Cornelius Holt was perhaps the most prosperous man in Dustcreek and the surrounding county, and he was also, in the experience of most people who had done business with him, something close to a human trap. He was 51 years old, heavyset, with silver in his beard and a way of dressing that was expensive and careful, and somehow still managed to look threatening. He owned the bank, a third of the grazing land east of town, and the largest house in Dustcreek, which had been built by craftsmen brought out from San Antonio at considerable expense. He had been widowed 7 years ago, and had since developed a reputation for looking at younger women in ways that made those women and their fathers uneasy. He had looked at Mamie Fairchild for some time. What Alfred had heard in the saloon the evening before, from a ranch hand named Pete Dobbins, who had it from the Fairchild's nearest neighbor, a widow woman named Clara Trent, was this: Cornelius Holt had called in Ezra Fairchild's loan. The note was due, and Ezra had nothing close to the funds to cover it. Holt had made an offer, not the decent kind, not the kind that involved payment plans or extensions or any of the ordinary mechanisms by which men in difficult circumstances were sometimes rescued from ruin. The offer was that the debt would be forgiven entirely, and that Ezra Fairchild would be permitted to live on his land and keep his house and his small remaining herd, on the condition that Mamie married Cornelius Holt by the end of the week. The wedding was to take place Saturday morning, which was tomorrow. Alfred had sat very still when Pete told him this. He had held his whiskey glass without drinking from it and stared at the worn grain of the bar for a long moment. Then he had set the glass down, stood up, thanked Pete for telling him, and walked out of the Red Spur into the warm summer night. He had thought about it for all of 30 minutes before he understood that he could not let the night pass without doing something. The something he settled on was simple and possibly foolish, but it was the only honest thing he could think of. He was going to ride to the Fairchild place and give Mamie a choice. Not a promise he couldn't back up, not a half-formed plan, but a real and genuine alternative. Because whatever Cornelius Holt had arranged with Ezra Fairchild, the one person nobody seemed to be consulting was Mamie herself, and that struck Alfred Winslow as a wrong that was not going to sit quietly in his chest. He told no one where he was going. He saddled his horse, a big buckskin gelding named Copper that he had raised from a colt and trusted with his life, and he rode out of the Callaway Ranch at 11 o'clock at night with the moon sitting low and yellow over the western hills. The ride was 12 miles. The night air still carried the day's heat at this hour, dry and faintly sweet with grass, and the sky above was enormous and salted thick with stars the way it always was out here, away from any town light. Copper moved at a steady pace on the familiar road, and Alfred let him find his own footing, keeping his hands easy on the reins and his mind running hard over what he intended to say when he got there. He was not going to propose to her out of pity. He was very clear on that point, and he rehearsed it to himself several times in the saddle. This was not charity. This was not a rescue motivated by the fact that he felt sorry for her. He did not feel sorry for Mamie Fairchild. She was one of the least pitiable people he had ever known. What he intended to tell her was the truth, that he had feelings for her that he had kept to himself because he had not known how to speak them, that he had wages saved and a plan for land if she would hear it, and that if she was being pushed into a marriage she did not want, he wanted her to know she had another option, a real one. Not because he needed to save her. She was fully capable of saying no to Cornelius Holt on her own, but because he did not want to live the rest of his life knowing he had been too quiet when it mattered most. The Fairchild place came into view just after midnight. It was a modest homestead, a low timber house, a small barn, a garden that Mamie kept with some determination against the drought, a split-rail fence along the front that her father had put up the first year they arrived. There was a lamp burning in the main room, the light coming warm and gold through the front window, and Alfred could see the shadow of a figure moving inside. He pulled Copper to a stop at the fence gate and sat still for a moment, suddenly very aware of the hour and the presumption of arriving at a woman's home at midnight. Then he thought about Saturday morning and Cornelius Holt, and he got down from his horse. He tied Copper to the fence post and walked to the front door. He knocked 3 times, not loud, not soft, just deliberate. There was a pause. Then he heard her voice, cautious and clear through the door. "Who is there?" "Alfred Winslow," he said. "I am sorry for the hour, Mamie. I need to speak with you." Another pause, then the sound of the bolt being drawn and the door opened. Mamie Fairchild stood in the doorway in her working clothes. She had not been to bed. She was wearing a dark calico dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hair was down, falling loose over her shoulders, dark red in the lamplight. She had clearly been doing accounts at the table behind her. He could see paper and an ink bottle and a ledger. Her expression when she saw him was complicated, surprised, guarded, and underneath both of those things, something that might have been relief. "Alfred," she said, "it is very late." "I know it," he said. "I apologize. I heard something this evening and I could not get it to settle. May I come in?" She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she sometimes did, carefully, not rushing to a conclusion. Then she stepped back and let him in. The house was neat and plain. There was a braided rug on the floor, a shelf of books, a cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and the lamp burning on the mantel. Ezra Fairchild's bedroom door at the back was closed. The old man was apparently asleep. Mamie crossed to the table and stood beside it, arms folded, watching Alfred with that direct gaze. "What did you hear?" she said. He took his hat off and held it in his hands. "I heard about your father's debt, and about Cornelius Holt's offer." Something moved across her face, not quite pain, not quite anger, a tightening around the eyes and mouth that came from a person working very hard to hold themselves steady. "Clara Trent," she said, not a question. "Pete Dobbins from Clara Trent," he confirmed. "Small town." "Yes," Mamie said quietly, "it is." She unfolded her arms and pulled out one of the chairs and sat down as though she had been standing up for a long time and had only just now permitted herself to stop. She pressed both palms flat on the ledger in front of her. "I suppose you rode 12 miles in the middle of the night to tell me you heard about it." "No," Alfred said. "I rode 12 miles to offer you a choice." She looked up at him then. Her eyes were green, a clear, steady green, and they were very tired, he saw. The tiredness of someone who had been sitting with a terrible problem for many hours. "What kind of choice?" she said. He pulled out the other chair across from her and sat down, putting his hat on his knee. He had rehearsed this a dozen times on the road, and now that he was here, looking at her across a lamplit table at midnight in a quiet house in West Texas, all the rehearsed words had gone somewhere else, and he was left with only the plain truth. "I have been saving my wages for 3 years," he said. "I have enough put by to make a down payment on a section of land near the creek that Eldon Marsh is looking to sell. It is not much land, not yet, but it is a start. I know cattle and I know horses and I know how to work. I think I can build something that will last." He paused. She was watching him without expression, listening. "I have had feelings for you for 2 years," he said, "and I kept them to myself because I thought I needed to be further along before I had the right to say it. That was my reasoning, and it may have been wrong reasoning, but it was honest. I am not a man with a great deal, Mamie, but I am a man who would never put you in the position you are in right now. I would never make you a bargaining piece." She was very still. "I am not asking you to marry me because of Holt," he continued. "I want to be clear on that. I am asking you because I want to. Because for 2 years there has not been a day that I did not think about you, and I have been too slow and too quiet about it, and tonight I cannot afford to be quiet anymore. But I am asking you, not arranging you, not requiring you, asking." The lamp flame wavered in a breath of air from somewhere. Outside, a night bird called once and went silent. Mamie looked down at her hands on the ledger. Then she looked up at him again. "My father has already told Holt yes," she said. "I know," Alfred said, "but did anyone ask you?" The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. He watched the ring spread across her face, first surprise, then something that looked dangerously close to tears, which was the last thing he had expected from Mamie Fairchild, who was possibly the most composed person he had ever known. "No," she said very quietly. "Nobody asked me." "Then I am asking," Alfred said. "What do you want, Mamie?" She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like water. Alfred waited. He had ridden 12 miles and he could wait a little longer. "I want my father's debt cleared," she said finally, her voice steady again. "I want him to keep this house. I want him to die in his own bed when the time comes, not in someone's charity room. I want those things badly enough that I was sitting here tonight preparing to tell myself they were worth the price." "I understand," Alfred said. "But," she continued, and her voice changed, something opened in it, something that had been held under lock for a long time. "I do not want Cornelius Holt. I have never wanted Cornelius Holt. I do not want to spend my life being furniture in a large house, decorating a rich man's parlor." She stopped. Her jaw was set. "I want a life that is mine." "Yes," Alfred said softly, "that is what I thought." She searched his face. "What is the plan, Alfred?" Not the feeling, the plan, because feelings do not clear a debt. And this was why he respected her. He straightened in his chair. "Eldon Marsh's land," he said. "I have spoken with him twice in passing, and he is willing to take what I have saved as the first installment and carry the rest on a private note at reasonable terms. He is not a bank. He is an old man who wants the land to go to someone who will use it. I can go to Marsh tomorrow morning and make it formal, and then I can go to Holt and offer him a payment toward your father's note." "The note is $340, Mamie said. She was watching him carefully, doing the arithmetic. "I have 260 saved, Alfred said. "It is not all of it, but I can offer Holt the full amount if he will give me until December. The fall cattle drive will settle the rest, and I can give him collateral in the meantime." "He will not accept it," Mamie said. "He does not want the money, not anymore. He wants—" She stopped herself. "I know what he wants," Alfred said, "and that is exactly why I am here." A long silence settled between them. The lamp burned low and steady. Mamie's hands were still on the ledger, and Alfred sat watching her work through whatever she was working through, not rushing her, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. Then she said, "You said you have feelings for me." "I did," he said, "for 2 years." "Yes." She tilted her head slightly, and something in her face shifted, not toward softness exactly, but toward honesty. The kind of honesty that is possible at midnight when the stakes are real and there is nothing left to protect. "I have wondered," she said carefully, "more than once whether you—" She stopped, started again. "I thought perhaps I had imagined it." "You did not imagine it," Alfred said. Her mouth curved, just at the corner, just briefly, the beginning of that laugh, the one he had been thinking about for 2 years. "You are remarkably difficult to read," she said. "I have been told that," he agreed. "And remarkably stubborn," she added. "Also true. And you rode 12 miles in the middle of the night because you could not let the morning come without saying this." "That is correct." She sat back in her chair and looked at him with that clear, measuring gaze, and he held it, because he meant every word he had said and he had nothing to hide. "If I said yes," she said slowly. "If I said yes to you, Alfred, not to being rescued, not to a bargain, but to you as a person, what would that look like?" He felt something loosen in his chest. "It would look like you telling me what you want," he said, "and me listening. And us figuring the rest out together. You make it sound simple." "It is not simple," he said, "but I think it is right." She looked at him for a long time, then she said, "I want to talk to my father before anything is decided." "Of course," Alfred said immediately. "Tonight," she added. He blinked. "It is past midnight." "I know what time it is," Mamie said, and she stood up and went to the door of Ezra Fairchild's room and knocked. The old man took some waking. When he came out, he was in his nightshirt with a blanket around his shoulders. his white hair wild and his eyes heavy with sleep and something else. The dark circles that came from worry and illness, and too many nights lying awake adding up numbers that would not come out right. He was a tall man, Ezra, but the past 2 years had taken something from his frame, and he stood in the doorway of his own room looking both surprised and wary at the sight of Alfred Winslow sitting at his table in the middle of the night. "Alfred," he said, "it is very late, son." "Yes, sir," Alfred said. "I apologize. Mamie wanted me to talk to you." Ezra looked at his daughter. His expression went through several things, quickly, guilt being the most prominent of them. "Pa," Mamie said, and her voice was very quiet and very even, the way her voice got when she was working hard to stay level. "I want you to know that I understand why you made the arrangement with Holt. I know you are trying to protect this house and this land and me. I know you believe you are doing the right thing." Ezra nodded slowly, his face creased with something close to pain. "But Pa," she continued, "I need you to hear me when I tell you that I cannot do it. I cannot marry that man. Not for the debt, not for the house, not for anything." She stopped. "I am not livestock. I am not a trade good. I am your daughter, and you know me well enough to know that this would destroy me in a way that poverty never could." The room was very still. Ezra Fairchild put one hand against the doorframe and looked at the floor. "I know it, Mamie girl," he said, and his voice was rough. "I know it. There was no other." "There is another way," Mamie said. "Alfred came tonight to offer one." Ezra looked at Alfred then, really looked at him, with the sharp and careful eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime reading people across cattle deals. Alfred explained the plan again, the land, the savings, the payment structure for Holt's note, the timeline for the fall drive. He laid it out plainly without embellishment, and when he was done, Ezra was quiet for a long time. "That is a generous offer," Ezra said at last. He paused. "But son, I need to ask you something plain." "Ask," Alfred said. "Is this something you are doing because you feel obligated, because of Christian charity or neighborliness or some other fine motive?" He fixed Alfred with a long look. "Or is this something else?" Alfred did not hesitate. "It is something else," he said. Ezra looked at his daughter. "And Mamie, you want this?" Mamie held her father's gaze. "I want the chance to find out," she said honestly. "I want the choice. That is all I am asking for tonight, the choice." Something passed across Ezra Fairchild's face, something old and tired and ultimately, after a long moment, relieved, as though he had been carrying a weight that he had not known how to put down and someone had finally shown him where to set it. "All right," he said. He looked at Alfred again. "You will go to Eldon Marsh first thing tomorrow." "Before sunrise," Alfred said. "And then to Holt." "Yes, sir." Ezra nodded slowly. "Then I will send word to Holt tonight. I will have Clara Trent's boy ride it over, that the arrangement is postponed pending another proposal." He put a hand over his eyes briefly. "He will be angry." "I know it," Alfred said. "I am not afraid of his anger." Ezra let out a long, tired breath. "No," he said, "I do not suppose you are." He looked at Alfred for another moment with those sharp old eyes, and then something in his face settled, a decision made and accepted. "You are a good man, Alfred Winslow. You always have been." "Thank you, sir," Alfred said. Ezra said good night and went back to his room. The door closed softly. Mamie and Alfred stood in the lamplit room and looked at each other across the table. "Well," Mamie said. "Well," Alfred agreed. She crossed her arms, but it was not a closed-off gesture this time. It was more like she was holding something precious very close to her chest. "You should try to get some sleep before you ride to Marsh," she said. "You can put your horse in the barn." He studied her. "You are not afraid of what Holt will say when he gets your father's message?" She lifted her chin slightly. "I have been afraid all evening," she said, "but not of Holt, not exactly." She paused. "Of ending up with no choice at all, that was the fear, and now I have one." He picked up his hat from the table. "Then that is enough for tonight," he said. She walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment on the threshold with the warm Texas night around them and the stars still blazing overhead and the smell of dry grass and dust and the faint sweetness of Mamie's kitchen behind them. "Alfred," she said. "Yes. I am glad you rode tonight." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had not let himself look for 2 years. "I should have ridden sooner," he said. I am sorry I was so slow. She shook her head slightly. You came when it mattered, she said. He settled his hat on his head and walked out to Copper and led the horse around to the barn. He was asleep on a pile of clean straw within 10 minutes, hat over his face, utterly at peace for the first time in as long as he could remember. He was up before first light, quiet so as not to wake the house, and he rode to Eldon Marsh's place as the sky went from black to gray to a narrow line of gold along the eastern horizon. Marsh was an old rancher, 70 if he was a day, who had decided his body was no longer up to working a full section, but whose attachment to fair dealing was still entirely intact. He received Alfred in his kitchen over coffee, heard the proposal, and after asking 3 clarifying questions and receiving 3 direct answers, shook Alfred's hand across the table and said the land was his. Alfred rode next to the telegraph office in town, which was not yet open, and waited on the steps until the operator arrived, and then sent a wire to the bank in Abilene, where he kept his savings account, requesting the transfer of $260 to the Dustcreek branch. Then he went to the general store and bought himself a clean shirt, because he was going to see Cornelius Holt next, and he intended to look presentable for what was going to be an unpleasant conversation. He found Holt at his bank at 9 in the morning, just as the doors were being unlocked by the teller. Cornelius Holt's office was at the back of the bank, behind a heavy oak door with his name lettered in gold on the glass panel. He was sitting behind a large desk when Alfred came in, and when he saw who it was, his face went through a quick succession of expressions: surprise, then irritation, then a cold and careful blankness that was the face he wore when he was calculating. "Winslow," he said, "I had a message from Ezra Fairchild last night that I found somewhat unusual." "Yes, sir," Alfred said. He stood in front of the desk without being invited to sit, hat in hand, and he was calm and direct and entirely unintimidated, because there were very few things about Cornelius Holt that could honestly frighten a man who had spent 6 years working cattle in West Texas weather. "I am here to discuss the Fairchild note." Holt leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together over his considerable middle. "Are you now?" he said. "I would like to propose a settlement," Alfred said. "The full amount of the note, $340, paid in 2 installments, $260 now, the remainder by the 1st of December. The Callaway Fall Drive will cover the balance, and I will offer the marsh land as collateral in the meantime." Holt's eyes did not change. They were a pale, flat blue, those eyes, and they gave nothing away. "The note is due," Holt said, "in full, by the end of this week." "I know its terms," Alfred said. "I am asking for an extension, and I am offering fair collateral. What I arranged with Ezra Fairchild," Holt said softly, "was a resolution that suited both parties." "It did not suit Mamie Fairchild," Alfred said. "And she is a party to the matter whether anyone acknowledged it or not." Something shifted behind Holt's pale eyes, a tightening, a recalculation. He studied Alfred for a long moment. "You have a personal interest in this," he said. It was not a question. "I have an honest one," Alfred said. "I have made Mamie Fairchild an offer of marriage. She has not yet accepted. But I am here to clear the path regardless of her answer, because the debt her father owes should be settled in dollars, not in a young woman's freedom." The silence in the office was the kind that has weight to it. Holt tapped one thick finger on his desk. "You are very confident for a ranch hand," he said. "I am a landowner as of this morning," Alfred said evenly. "And I am confident because I am right." Another long pause. Alfred could see Holt running the numbers, weighing the options whether to press his original arrangement and face the potential embarrassment of public knowledge about its terms, or to accept a straightforward financial settlement and save face. It was the last part that decided him, Alfred suspected. Cornelius Holt was a man who cared deeply about how he appeared in Dustcreek. "December 1st, Holt said at last. "The remaining $80 plus interest at 5%, and the marsh land deed held here as security." "Agreed," Alfred said immediately. "I will have the deed here by end of day." They did not shake hands. Alfred picked up his hat and left. He stood outside the bank in the bright morning sun and felt the tension he had been holding since the night before slowly release from his shoulders. He pressed a hand against his sternum and breathed. Then he walked to the telegraph office and sent a second wire, a short one, to a cousin in San Antonio who was a notary, asking about the fastest route to a wedding license if one were needed before the county judge came through next month. He was perhaps getting slightly ahead of himself, but he was a man who liked to know his options. He rode back to the Fairchild place in the late morning. The sun was climbing high and the land shimmered in the heat, and the grasshoppers were singing in every direction. Mamie was in the garden when he arrived, on her knees between the rows of beans and squash with a worn straw hat on her head and her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and she looked up when she heard Copper's hooves on the dry ground. She stood and brushed the soil from her hands and came to the fence, and she read his face before he said a word. "You settled it," she said. "I settled it," he confirmed. He got down from Copper and tied him to the post and leaned against the fence, and he told her everything: Marsh, the land, the bank transfer, Holt's office, the terms they had agreed to. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the afternoon sun catching the red in her hair. "So my father's debt is cleared," she said. "Being cleared," he corrected gently, "by December. And you own land now. As of this morning." She turned her face slightly away, looking out across the dry garden, and he let her think. He was very aware of the fact that he had put several things in motion before she had answered his question from the night before, and that there was a version of events in which she could reasonably find that presumptuous. "Mamie," he said, "I want to be clear about something." She turned back to him. "The debt would be settled the same way regardless," he said. "Even if your answer to me is no. Your father's land is not held hostage to your acceptance. That was never the arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know that, Alfred. I knew it last night." Something in her face opened the way a window opens on a spring morning, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a gradual quality that changed the whole light in the room. "You are not that kind of man." "I hope not," he said. She put both hands on the top rail of the fence, and he noticed her fingers were trembling very slightly, not from distress, he thought, but from the particular kind of emotion that comes from standing at the edge of a very large decision. "I have been thinking all morning," she said, "about what I want. You asked me that last night, and I have been thinking about it since." "And," he said, she looked at him straight. "I want you," she said. "Not because of the debt, not because of Holt, not because you rode 12 miles in the middle of the night, though that is a very persuasive argument. I want you because when I thought about spending my life with someone, it was already your face in that thought. I just did not know you saw it the same way." Alfred had spent 2 years being careful and measured and quiet about Mamie Fairchild, and in this moment all of that careful restraint left him entirely. He reached across the fence rail and took her hand, both her hands, lacing his fingers through hers, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him. And the laugh came, that full, brilliant, unexpected laugh, and his chest ached with the fullness of it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "You ridiculous, slow, wonderful man. Yes." He grinned a wide, uncomplicated grin that was not the expression he usually wore, and she looked a little startled by it, and then she laughed again. "You have a very fine smile," she said. "You should use it more." "I generally need a reason," he said. "Then I will try to provide them regularly," she told him, and she turned his hand over in hers and held it like something she intended to keep. The following weeks in Dustcreek were busy and occasionally complicated, in the way that all good things tend to be. Cornelius Holt received the deed to the marshland, which Alfred immediately and somewhat pointedly renamed the Winslow acreage in the county record, and said nothing publicly about the change of plans regarding Mamie Fairchild. He was not a man who advertised his defeats, which Alfred found was just about the only quality he and Holt had in common. The news of Alfred and Mamie spread through Dustcreek the way all news spread through small towns, which is to say almost instantly, and with some embellishment. Clara Trent told anyone who would listen that she had suspected it for years. The women at the church were divided on the subject. Some thought it was terribly romantic, and some thought the timing was suspicious. But Mamie Fairchild had never particularly adjusted her life to the opinion of people who had not earned the right to hold one about it, and she did not start now. They were married by the county judge on a Saturday afternoon in late August, 6 weeks after Alfred had knocked on her door at midnight. The ceremony was held in the Fairchild front room, with Ezra Fairchild standing straighter than he had in months, and Clara Trent weeping pleasantly in the corner, and Pete Dobbins and 2 other Callaway Ranch hands, Jack Hemies and Roy Acaffer, standing near the door in their Sunday shirts with their hats in their hands. The judge was a compact, serious man named Aldridge, who had been performing marriages in this county for 20 years, and who had the particular skill of making a legal ceremony feel genuinely moving without making it feel theatrical. Mamie wore a dress of cream-colored muslin that she and Clara had sewn in 4 frantic days, with small buttons up the back and a wide collar, and her hair pinned up with the little carved wooden pins that had been her mother's. She looked, Alfred thought, when she came to stand beside him in the afternoon light, like someone who had made a decision, and was at peace with it, not resigned at all, but settled in the deep and certain way of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. He took her hand when the judge told him to, and her fingers were steady this time. The words the judge spoke were the ordinary legal words, and they said them back, and when it was done and the judge said Alfred could kiss his bride, he cupped her face in both hands carefully, as though she were something of enormous value, which she was, and kissed her, and Clara Trent wept harder, and Pete Dobbins let out a whoop that he immediately tried to suppress, and Ezra Fairchild put his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. They moved to the Winslow acreage in September. The land that had been Eldon Marshes was not rich land. It was a section of dry creek bottom and patchy grass, with a modest timber house that needed work, and a barn that needed new boards on the west wall, and a well that was solid. But it had good bones, the way that land can have good bones, and Alfred had been studying it since the day Marsh had shaken his hand, and he had a plan for it that was detailed and specific and, Mamie thought, entirely achievable, because when Alfred Winslow put his mind to a thing he was absolutely relentless about it. The first months were hard in the way that beginnings are always hard. They were learning each other's daily rhythms, learning how to share a small space and a large set of responsibilities, learning the particular language of a partnership that is also a love. There were mornings when the well pump froze and evenings when the stove smoked and days when the cattle prices came in low, and the arithmetic of the operation felt more precarious than it looked from the outside. There were also evenings when the work was done and the supper was finished, and they sat on the narrow porch in the cooling air and really talked, the way they had always talked, about books and cattle and the politics of the territory and what they wanted for the future, and those evenings were so good that they made the hard days feel not just bearable but worthwhile. Alfred discovered that Mamie was an exceptionally capable partner, which he had expected, and that she was also funnier than he had realized, which delighted him. She had a dry, precise wit that came out most often when she was tired, and she had strong opinions about everything from fence-post spacing to the proper way to make biscuits, and she was usually right, which he found he had no trouble acknowledging. She discovered that Alfred was patient in a way that was not passive. He was not a man who let things slide, but he was a man who chose his battles with great deliberateness, and who, when he committed to a position, held it with a quietness that was somehow more effective than loudness would have been. She also discovered that he sang to himself sometimes when he was working in the barn, low and mostly tuneless, and she found this so unexpected and so endearing that the first time she heard it, she had to go around the other side of the barn and stand there pressing her hand over her mouth so she would not laugh and embarrass him. She told him about it eventually. He looked at her with great dignity and said he had no idea what she was talking about, and she laughed until she had tears on her cheeks, and then he laughed too, which was perhaps the best thing she had seen yet. They paid the last $80 of Ezra Fairchild's debt to Cornelius Holt on the 1st of November, a full month before the December deadline, because the fall drive came in better than expected, and Alfred had also sold 2 horses that he had trained over the summer. He brought the money to the bank himself, counted it out in front of Holt's teller in exact bills and coin, and waited while it was recorded, and the deed to the Winslow acreage was returned to him across the counter. He folded the deed and put it in his breast pocket and walked out of the bank into the November sunlight and went directly to the telegraph office and sent a 1-sentence wire to Mamie at the ranch. "It is done." She read it in the kitchen and set it on the table and put her hand flat on it and closed her eyes for a moment, and then she squared her shoulders and went back to the bread she was making, because there was still a great deal of work to do, and sentiment was best expressed at the end of a finished day. Ezra Fairchild's health had been improving, to everyone's cautious surprise. The relief of the debt, and perhaps the relief of seeing his daughter settled in a life she had chosen for herself, seemed to have done something that the doctor's prescriptions had not quite managed. He was still a fragile man, his chest still unreliable in cold weather, but he was upright and engaged with the world in a way he had not been for 2 years. He rode out to the Winslow place on the first Sunday of every month and had dinner with them, and Alfred always made sure to ask his advice about something, because Ezra Fairchild had been a working cattleman for 40 years, and his knowledge was genuine, and his opinions were worth hearing. And Alfred was a man who understood that wisdom was not always attached to a deed of ownership. Cornelius Holt stayed in Dustcreek, as men like him always do. He did not trouble the Winslows, and Alfred did not trouble him, and the town was large enough in the way of small towns to accommodate that kind of mutual, politely hostile peace. Holt remarried the following year, a widow from Abilene who had her own money and her own opinions, and by all accounts, the arrangement suited them both considerably better than his previous plan would have suited anyone. The winter that first year was cold and dry and required a great deal of fence mending, and hay hauling and stove tending, and it was also one of the best periods of Alfred's life, cold blue mornings, with Mamie's dark red hair loose over her shoulders and her face flushed from the stove warmth, evenings reading side by the lamp, the particular satisfaction of having done hard necessary work all day, and then coming in to find someone who was genuinely glad to see you. Not just because you were useful, but because you were you. He caught himself watching her sometimes, the way she moved around the kitchen with complete assurance, the way she read, with her finger absently tracing the edge of the page, the way she looked when she was outside in the cold, cheeks pink and breath making little clouds in the air and her eyes very bright. He had spent 2 years watching her from the careful distance of restraint, and now he could watch openly, and the freedom of it still sometimes surprised him. One evening in January, with the wind coming hard from the north and the fire burning well in the stove, she set down the book she was reading and looked at him across the table where he was going over his livestock accounts and said, "Alfred, do you know what I think about most?" "Tell me," he said, setting down his pencil. She rested her chin in her hand. "I think about what would have happened if you had not come that night." He was quiet for a moment. "What would have happened?" "I would have married Holt," she said simply. "I would have talked myself into it by morning. I was very nearly there." She paused. "I had made myself a list of the things I could do within that life, the books I could buy with his money, the way I could manage his household to give myself some sphere of control, the ways I could be useful. I was working very hard on that list." She looked at him steadily. "And then you knocked on the door." Alfred leaned forward on the table. "Mamie," he said. "I am not saying it to distress you," she said. "I am saying it because I want you to know that what you did that night it was more than you probably knew. It was not just the debt and the house. It was that someone came and asked me what I wanted." She stopped. I had not been asked that in a very long time. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair, and she turned to face him, and he took her hands in his and held them. I am going to keep asking, he said, for the rest of our lives, what you want, what you need, what you think every day. She looked at him with those clear green eyes, and for a moment her composure slipped just slightly, in the way it very rarely did, just enough that he could see the full depth of what was underneath. I know you will, she said softly. That is the thing, Alfred, I know you will. He kissed her there in the firelight, not dramatically, just carefully and thoroughly, the way he did everything. Spring came to the Winslow acreage in March, and with it, the work of planting and the assessment of what the winter had cost them and what the new season could recover. Alfred had been thinking for months about expanding the horse operation. He had a real gift for the work. Everyone said so, and trained horses brought considerably better prices than cattle at the moment, and there was a market for them in both San Antonio and the Army supply depots north of town. He laid the plan out for Mamie one evening, and she sat with it and asked her questions sharp, specific questions about cost and timeline and cash flow during the gap between buying stock and selling finished horses. And when he had answered them satisfactorily, she said yes, and they shook hands over it with mock formality, and then she ruined the formality by laughing, which he found he was deeply glad of every single time it happened. In the spring, two things happened that mattered. The first was that Clara Trent's son, a boy of 15 named Will, asked if he could do odd work around the Winslow place after school in exchange for riding lessons. Alfred liked Will Trent. He was serious and willing and good with animals in the instinctive way that some people simply are, and he said yes, and the boy became a regular presence at the place, and the beginnings of something that would eventually be a proper working operation became visible. The second thing that happened was that Mamie told Alfred, on a warm April morning with the creekside cottonwoods starting to leaf out green and gold, that she was expecting a child. He went very still when she told him. She watched him carefully, and he felt her watching, and after a moment he realized he had been standing with his mouth slightly open and not saying anything, and he closed his mouth and took a step toward her and then stopped again, because there was too much feeling in his chest to allow for smooth navigation. Alfred, she said, with the beginning of amusement. Give me a moment, he said. She folded her hands in front of her and waited, the picture of patience, while he collected himself. A baby, he said finally. Yes, she said, that is generally how it works. Our baby, exclusively ours, yes. He closed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, and she looked up at him with those clear, shining eyes. Are you well? He asked. How are you feeling? Have you spoken to the doctor? I am well. I feel mostly well except in the mornings, and no, I have not yet spoken to the doctor, but I intend to next week, she said efficiently. Then more softly, Alfred, this is a good thing. It is the best thing, he said, and his voice was rough in a way he had not planned for. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating under it, and he put his hand over hers and held it there, and they stood in the morning light with the cottonwoods moving in the wind around them. Ezra Fairchild, when told, was struck momentarily speechless, and then talked for 45 minutes straight about the importance of rest and good food, and not letting a pregnant woman lift anything heavy, most of which Mamie listened to with the tolerant patience of someone who has been managing their own physical welfare successfully for 22 years and intends to go on doing so. The summer of 1879 was hot and full of work, and also full of something else, a particular warmth between them that had been building since that midnight arrival and had deepened over the months into something that had real substance to it, real dailiness. The love that is not just the feeling you have at the beginning, but the accumulation of choosing each other over and over through the ordinary texture of life. Alfred found new ways every day to appreciate Mamie Fairchild, the thoroughness with which she thought about everything, the absolute absence of self-pity in her, her generosity, which was not the soft and indiscriminate kind, but the specific and considered kind that was directed where it would actually do good, Her capacity for joy in small things that were genuinely joyful while maintaining a clear-eyed honesty about hard things that were genuinely hard. Mamie found new ways every day to appreciate Alfred Winslow. The way he listened, fully and without impatience. The steadiness that was not stiffness but deep-rootedness. The particular way he had of solving problems that involved sitting with them quietly until the solution surfaced, which was completely different from her own approach of working at a problem actively from all angles, but which complemented hers in a way she had not expected. His hands, which were calloused and careful and which she associated now with security, the way he looked at her, the way he had always looked at her, even before, when he was trying so hard not to. In October of 1879, their son was born. The birth was attended by the doctor, who had ridden out from Dustcreek, and Clara Trent, who had insisted on being there in the capacity of a woman who had been through it twice and knew how things were supposed to go. Alfred waited outside on the porch through the long hours of it, which were the most difficult hours of his life up to that point, because there was nothing he could do to help the most important person in his world, and he was not built for helplessness. At 3 in the morning, Clara opened the door and told him to come in. The room smelled of wood smoke and clean linens, and the particular weightedness of something significant having just occurred. Mamie was in the bed, propped against the pillows, her hair damp and loose and her face exhausted and radiant, and in her arms was a small, red-faced, emphatically real person. Alfred sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, and the feeling in his chest was something he had no word for, not happiness exactly, though it contained happiness, but something larger and more fundamental than that. Something that felt like the ground shifting and then settling, permanently changed. "A boy," Mamie said. She was looking at the baby with the expression of someone who has just understood something that they had previously only known intellectually. "A boy," Alfred repeated. He reached out one careful hand and touched the baby's cheek, so impossibly small, the skin so new, and the baby turned his head toward the touch with the blind, certain instinct of the newly arrived. "What do you want to name him?" Mamie asked. Alfred thought for a moment. "James," he said, "after my father." She looked at him. His father had died when Alfred was 14, and she knew the shape of that grief without needing him to detail it. "James Winslow," she said. She looked back at the baby. "Hello, James." James Winslow appeared unimpressed with the occasion. He squinted and then went back to sleep. Clara Trent, who had been discreetly tidying the far corner of the room with tears streaming down her face, let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "He looks just like you, Alfred," she announced. Alfred looked at the small, sleeping, red-faced creature. "I hope not," he said seriously. "Not yet anyway." Mamie laughed, and the sound of it in that room at 3 in the morning was the best sound Alfred had ever heard in his life, and he was going to hold it in his memory for the rest of his days. Ezra Fairchild came the following morning and held his grandson for a long time, sitting in the rocking chair in the front room with the baby in the crook of his arm, and a look on his face that Alfred had never seen before, a complete and uncomplicated peace, as though the old man had set down the last of whatever burdens he had been carrying and found that his arms, free of them, were exactly strong enough for this. "You did well, Mamie girl," Ezra said. "We did well," Mamie said from the doorway, and she looked at Alfred when she said it. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, each one adding to the substance of what had come before. The Winslow horse operation grew steadily. Alfred had a real reputation for the quality of his trained animals by 1881, with buyers coming from 3 counties. He hired Will Trent full-time at 16 and trained him alongside the horses, and Will was a natural and a good and honest worker, and eventually became as much a part of the Winslow operation as the land itself. Mamie ran the household accounts with the same precision she had applied to her father's failing ledgers, but in a better cause now, and she also took on the school question in Dustcreek with a seriousness that nobody had quite expected. She organized the women of the county writing letters and holding meetings in the Fairchild front room and occasionally in her own kitchen, and by 1882, Dustcreek had a proper schoolhouse with a proper teacher, a young woman named Harriet Boone who had come from a teaching college in Missouri and who was completely competent and entirely unintimidated by Texas, and who became Mamie's particular friend. Dustcreek itself changed in those years, the way frontier towns either change or die. The railroad came through 20 miles to the south in 1880, which was close enough to affect prices and access without close enough to entirely disrupt the particular texture of the place. New families arrived, new businesses opened. The church steeple was finally straightened in the autumn of 1881 by a combined crew of 6 men who argued about the proper angle the entire time and got it done in an afternoon. The saloon changed hands twice and was eventually bought by a man named Callum Rays, who improved the quality of the food served there and gradually transformed it into something closer to a dining establishment that happened to serve whiskey, which the older residents considered a moral decline and the newer ones considered an improvement. Cornelius Holt became less of a presence in Dustcreek as the decade advanced. His second wife, the capable widow from Abilene, turned out to have significant business interests of her own that kept them both occupied, and by most accounts, contentedly so. He and Alfred never became friends, and that was fine with both of them. Ezra Fairchild lived to see his grandson James take his first steps and speak his first words, which were, appropriately, something close to hoarse, and he lived to see the Dustcreek School open, and to help Alfred mend the east fence of the Winslow acreage in the spring of 1881, moving slowly but moving, making himself useful. He died quietly in his own bed in the winter of 1882, as he had wanted, with Mamie at his side and his hand in hers, and a look on his face in those last hours of a man who had lived long enough to see things come right. Mamie grieved for her father the way she did most things, with absolute honesty about the full weight of it, and without any attempt to be finished with the grief before the grief was finished with her. Alfred stayed close during those weeks and did not try to talk her out of what she was feeling or rush her toward a more comfortable state. He made sure she ate, made sure she slept, made sure someone else handled the outdoor work so she didn't have to fill every hour with physical labor to avoid feeling what she was feeling. And in the evenings, he sat with her and let her talk when she wanted to talk and was quiet when she needed quiet. And she thought more than once that this was the most significant kindness she had ever been shown, the gift of having someone fully present with you in your sorrow. James, at 3, was not precisely helpful in the grieving process, because James was interested in everything in the world with a ferocity that made it genuinely difficult to stay too long in a dark place when he was in the room. He had his mother's coloring, the red hair, already unmistakable on a toddler, and his father's serious gray eyes, and he combined these genetic inheritances into a personality that was simultaneously thoughtful and absolutely indefatigable, which kept both his parents in a state of mild exhaustion and deep delight. It was James, some months after Ezra's death, who provided one of those moments that families return to in the telling. He had gotten into the feed room of the barn. Alfred was working in the corral and thought he was with Mamie, and Mamie thought he was with Alfred, and had attempted to give the barn cat a bath in the water trough, with predictable results for all parties. Alfred found him sitting in 4 inches of water looking deeply satisfied with the results of the experiment, while the cat, who had long since escaped, could be heard making her opinion known from somewhere in the rafters above. "James," Alfred said from the doorway. James looked up at his father. "Cat," he said. "Dirty." Alfred looked at the soaking child, the soaking trough, the displaced feed sacks, and the cat making furious commentary overhead, and made a sound that he attempted to pass off as a cough, with absolutely no success. He carried James into the house under his arm like a rolled blanket, deposited him in front of Mamie with a brief explanatory sentence, and excused himself back to the barn, ostensibly to check the water trough, actually to stand behind the barn with his hand over his mouth. Mamie, who had handled the aftermath, found him there when she came looking 20 minutes later. He heard her coming and straightened up, the picture of dignity. "Alfred Winslow," she said. "Mamie," he said. "You laughed." I made a reasonable sound under the circumstances. She crossed her arms. Her eyes were bright. "He is 3 years old," she said. "He will be impossible if you encourage him." "I did not encourage anything," Alfred said. "I removed the situation from the barn and brought it to you, dripping on my kitchen floor. That was incidental." She stared at him. Then she covered her mouth with one hand exactly the way he had. He watched her shoulders shake. "The cat," she said. "The cat," he agreed. They laughed together at the back of the barn like two people who are genuinely happy, which is what they were. James was joined in the summer of 1883 by a sister, whom they named Ruth, after Alfred's mother, a calm, bright-eyed baby who from the first days of her life seemed to be observing everything with great seriousness, as though taking inventory of the world and finding it satisfactory. James, who had been warned extensively about the arrival, inspected her with scientific interest, and then announced that she was very small and he would teach her about horses when she was bigger, which Alfred thought showed considerable planning for a 4-year-old. Ruth Winslow grew into exactly the person her first weeks had suggested she would be: considered, precise, deeply observant. She had Alfred's coloring, dark-haired and gray-eyed, and Mamie's directness, and she was walking at 10 months and talking in full sentences at 18, mostly to inform everyone around her of things they had not noticed and probably should have. The Winslow acreage by the mid-1880s had become something genuinely worth the name ranch. Alfred had expanded the original section twice, buying adjacent land as it became available, and the horse operation had grown to the point where he needed 2 full-time hands beyond Will Trent, who had been made foreman at 20 and took the responsibility with the gravity and capability Alfred had always expected from him. The cattle side was smaller, deliberately so, and the income from the horses was steady and good, and there was a new room added to the house in 1884, because 2 children and 2 adults in the original structure had become, as Mamie put it with considerable understatement, cozy. The new room was built by Alfred and Will Trent and Roy Acaffer, who had stayed in the area after his years at the Callaway Ranch and now had a small place of his own nearby. Jack Hemies was there too, on the weekends, because the 4 of them had stayed close in the way of men who have worked alongside each other and know each other's quality. They were loud and argumentative about the proper way to hang a door and ate everything Mamie put on the table and left sawdust tracked through the kitchen for 2 weeks, and it was one of the best building projects Alfred had ever been part of. Mamie, for her part, had become the sort of person that people in Dustcreek came to when they had a problem that required clear thinking. She was on the school board. She helped organize relief for 2 families who lost their homes to fire in 1884. She wrote letters to the county seat about the road conditions between Dustcreek and the Southern Railroad town, which were genuinely hazardous, and about which nothing was done for 3 years, after which she wrote louder letters, and then something was done. She also continued reading, with the same appetite she had always had, the books still stacked on the windowsill, the catalog orders arriving a few times a year, the discussions with Alfred in the evenings that ranged widely and almost never ended without at least one person having changed their mind about something. Alfred thought sometimes, on evenings like those, sitting on the porch in the cooling air with the sound of James and Ruth somewhere inside engaged in some project that was probably not entirely sanctioned, the land spread out before them in the long Texas dusk, that his life had a quality he could not have precisely articulated when he was young, but that he now understood completely. It was not the absence of difficulty, because there was plenty of that: hard winters, dry summers, market fluctuations, the ordinary and continuous work of keeping a place alive. It was something underneath all of that, a groundedness that came from being exactly where he was supposed to be with exactly the person he was supposed to be with. He said this to Mamie one such evening, somewhat clumsily, because he was not a man who could always translate what he felt into smooth language but with complete sincerity. She listened to him, sitting beside him with her shoulder against his, looking out at the dusk land. "I know what you mean," she said. "I have felt it every day." She paused. "I think about the other road sometimes, not often and not with any real longing, but sometimes." "What do you think about it?" he asked. "I think it was a road with walls on both sides," she said. "And this is open country." She gestured at the land in front of them with one hand, the dry grass catching the last of the light, the creek glinting in the distance, the sky going from rose to violet in the east. "All of this. It is not easy, but it is open." He reached over and took her hand. "I am glad you let me in that night," he said. She turned her head to look at him with a glint of the old amusement. "You knocked very deliberately," she said. "I do not think I had a great deal of choice." "You had every choice," he said. She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said softly. "That was the point." They sat in the evening air, hands linked, and watched the sky finish its business of going from day to night. And the first stars came out, and from inside the house they heard James explaining something to Ruth with great authority, and Ruth responding with what was clearly a counterargument of equal confidence. And both of them, Alfred and Mamie, both smiled at the sound without looking away from the sky. In 1886, Will Trent married a girl named Lucy Broward from the town to the east, and Alfred and Mamie attended the wedding, and Alfred gave Will a quarter section of the southernmost Winslow land as his wedding gift, not borrowed, not loaned, but given, because Will Trent had been part of what the Winslow place had become, and that deserved recognition in a permanent way. Will stood in front of his new wife and his employer, and was unable to say anything for a full 30 seconds, which Alfred found satisfying, because it meant the thing had landed with the weight he intended. James Winslow, at 7, attended the Dustcreek school and distinguished himself by being, as his teacher Harriet Boone reported to Mamie with a mixture of exasperation and affection, deeply interested in everything that was not directly related to the lesson at hand. He was clever, that was clear, but his cleverness tended to wander, following whatever thread seemed most interesting in the moment, and corralling it toward a specific subject required the kind of patience and strategic thinking that Harriet Boone, who was an excellent teacher, had in considerable supply. He also had his father's stubbornness, the quiet, unshakable kind, which was occasionally maddening and occasionally impressive, depending entirely on what he was being stubborn about. Ruth, at 3, was in the opinion of everyone who met her going to be a person of significant consequence when she grew up, and the general uncertainty was only about the specific direction of that consequence. Mamie had thought by then that their family was complete: 2 children, a sound house, the work she cared about in the community. Alfred had not pushed the matter either direction. But in the spring of 1888, a third child arrived, another boy, born in April with the apple trees blooming outside the window, whom they named Ezra, for the grandfather who had never been anything but well-intentioned, even in his worst decisions. Young Ezra was, from the first weeks, a notably cheerful person. He cried very little and smiled almost constantly, and appeared to find the world, from the beginning, a fundamentally friendly place, which was a quality entirely distinct from either of his parents and different from both his siblings, and which James, at 9, considered suspicious, and Ruth, at 5, considered delightful. The house that had been extended in 1884 was extended again, more gradually this time, an extra bedroom here, a wider porch there, and it became the kind of house that feels entirely natural in its setting, that looks as though it has been there forever and belongs completely to its particular piece of ground. Alfred turned 36 in the autumn of 1888, and Mamie planned a small dinner, his nature being the kind that found large celebrations more tiring than pleasurable. With the Trents and Roy Ackaffer, and Jack Hemies and Clara Trent, who was by now a permanent fixture in the Winslow children's lives, and who considered herself their grandmother by the right of long acquaintance and considerable affection, which position everyone endorsed. It was a warm October night, the windows open, the house full of noise and the smell of Mamie's cooking, and the voices of people who liked each other's company. Alfred sat at the head of his table and looked down its length, the children, the friends, the face of his wife at the other end, catching his eye with a particular smile that was only for him, and felt the feeling again, the one he had no exact word for, the one that was larger than happiness. Mamie raised her glass. It was just water. It was not a drinking occasion, and the table went quiet. "To Alfred," she said, looking at him steadily across the table, "who rode 12 miles in the middle of the night because he thought I deserved a choice." She paused. I did not tell him then, and I should have, that it was one of the bravest things I have ever seen, not because it was dramatic, because he did it without any certainty of outcome, without any guarantee, just because it was the right thing. The table was quiet. Alfred looked at his wife across all the faces of the people they loved and felt the rawness of being genuinely known. "To Alfred," said Will Trent, and raised his glass. "To Alfred," said Clara Trent, already tearful. "To Papa," said James matter-of-factly, and raised his cup of milk. "To Papa," Ruth echoed very seriously. Baby Ezra, who was in Alfred's lap, grabbed the edge of the table and made a sound of general enthusiasm. Alfred looked at Mamie. She was still watching him with that particular smile. "Thank you," he said, just that. Quietly enough that it was only for her. She understood him perfectly. She always had. After supper, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, they sat together on the wide porch in the October dark. The air smelled of wood smoke from the chimney and the cooling grass and the particular dryness of a Texas autumn. The stars were out in their full extravagance, the way they always were out here. "You said something tonight," Alfred said, "about not having any certainty of outcome." "Yes," Mamie said. "I had some certainty," he said. She tilted her head. "Of what?" "That it was worth the attempt," he said. "That was a certainty, regardless of how it came out." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Even if I had said no, even then," he said, "you would have had the choice. That was the thing that mattered." She was quiet for a moment, and he waited, because that was who he was, a man who let things arrive at their own pace. "You are a very good man," she said then, with a directness that she reserved for the most honest moments. "Not because of what you did that night, though that was good, but because of every day since. The way you do everything, the way you show up." He looked at the stars. "You are the best thing in my life," he said simply. "You and the children, this place." He turned to look at her. All of it came from that one night, all of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did not always do. She was not given to the more demonstrative gestures as a rule, and the fact that she did it meant more for being less usual. "I was thinking this morning," she said, "about that night, about the ledger I was working on, the list I was making for myself." She paused. "I was so deep in the practical management of a terrible situation that I had stopped asking whether the situation itself was acceptable." "People do that," Alfred said. "I know," she said. "And someone knocked on my door." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about other women in that situation, women who did not have someone knock, women whose fathers made arrangements and whose consent was not considered necessary." Alfred was quiet for a moment. "There are too many of them," he said. "Yes," she said. She lifted her head and looked at the sky. "I was lucky. I was lucky in who you are and in the fact that you came." She paused. "I do not want to just be grateful for my own luck." He understood what she was saying. "The school," he said. "The school is one thing," she said. "I want to do more. I want to—" She stopped. "I want girls to know that they can say no, that they have the right. That a choice is not something to be grateful for, it is something you are owed." Alfred thought about this. "Tell me what you want to do," he said. So she told him, there on the porch in the October dark. about the thing she had been thinking about for some time, the letters she wanted to write to other county seats, the conversations she wanted to have with the judge who came through Dustcreek, the way she thought women's property and consent rights needed to be not just a private value, but a public conversation in the county, in the territory, in the larger world that was still being figured out here in the West, where the rules were sometimes only as good as the people making them. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "What do you need from me?" She turned to look at him. "You are not going to tell me it is too ambitious." "No," he said simply. "Or that I should concentrate on the household." He looked at her as though she had said something only mildly comprehensible. "Mamie," he said, "have I ever given you reason to expect that from me?" She smiled. "No," she said, "not once." She paused. "That was the wrong question. I apologize." "You were testing," he said, not unkindly. "Old habit," she said, "from before." "Before me," he said. "Before you," she confirmed. "I spent a long time expecting to have to fight for the right to be myself. Even with you sometimes I still wait for the other shoe." He reached over and took her hand. "It is never going to come," he said. She looked at her hand in his for a moment. Then she looked at him with her eyes very clear and very direct in the starlight. "I know," she said. "I know that. Every day I know it more." She squeezed his hand. "It is a very strange and wonderful thing, Alfred Winslow, to be known by someone. To be completely known and completely." She stopped, searching for the word. "Wanted," he offered. She exhaled. "Yes," she said, "wanted, exactly that." The night was very still and very full of stars, and the house behind them was warm with sleeping children, and the smell of the dinner they had made together, and the land stretched out in front of them in the dark, their land, earned and worked and belonging to them both equally in every way that mattered. "Mamie," Alfred said. "Yes. I would ride that road 100 times." She was quiet for a moment. Then, soft and certain, "So would I." They sat together on the porch until the night got cold enough to drive them inside, which took some time, because neither of them was in any hurry to end the evening, and the stars had no opinion about the schedule either way. Then they went inside to their house and their children and their life, which was imperfect and real and entirely, completely theirs. In the years that followed, Mamie did what she had said she would do. She wrote her letters. She had her conversations. She worked with Harriet Boone and Clara Trent and several other women in the county to make certain that the school's curriculum included not just reading and arithmetic, but the practical knowledge of what rights a woman held and what she was entitled to ask for. She met with the circuit judge 3 times over 2 years before he began to take her seriously, and when he did, he found her arguments so thoroughly prepared and so logically airtight that he had very little room to disagree. She was not the only one doing this work, and she was not under the illusion that she was changing the whole world. The world was large and stubborn and slow, but she was doing what she could reach, and she did it fully. Alfred supported her in all of it, practically and completely. He took on more of the household management when she was occupied with her other work. He rode with her to meetings in the next town when the roads were bad. He read the documents she wrote and gave her his honest opinion when she asked for it, and held his tongue when she did not, which was the more difficult skill of the two. James Winslow grew into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's appetite for the world, and who decided at 15 that he was going to be a doctor, a declaration that surprised everyone slightly, and then, upon reflection, surprised no one at all, because James had always been interested in understanding how things worked. Alfred began corresponding with medical schools on his son's behalf when James was 16, a project that involved a significant amount of letter writing and research into available institutions in Texas and in the larger country beyond, and which occupied considerable evenings over 2 years. Ruth, brilliant and precise as she had always been, took to mathematics with a ferocity that delighted her father and somewhat baffled her mother, who was perfectly capable with numbers, but had never found in them the aesthetic pleasure that Ruth apparently did. She was also the best writer of the 3 Winslow children, which she and Alfred never explicitly competed about but which they both knew, and which was a source of very quiet pride on both sides. Young Ezra, the cheerful one, turned out to have a gift for music. He could pick out melodies on the old piano that sat in the corner of the schoolhouse, and Harriet Boone began giving him lessons when he was 6, and by 10 he was playing for the Sunday services in the church, which the congregation found both charming and considerably more melodious than the previous arrangement. The three of them grew up in the house that Alfred had built and extended and kept with his hands, on the land he had bought with the savings of his young manhood, in a town that their mother had helped make better, in a time that was still figuring itself out. And they grew up knowing what it looked like when two people loved each other honestly and chose each other every day, which was perhaps the most important thing they learned at home. In 1893, when the Dustcreek school celebrated its 10th anniversary, for it was Mamie who had pushed it into existence in 1882, and 10 years felt like an occasion, the town held a small gathering in the schoolyard on a May afternoon, with tables set out and food brought by a dozen families. Harriet Boone gave a speech that was warm and funny and accurate, and then she said there was one person without whom none of it would have happened, and she looked at Mamie, and everyone looked at Mamie, and Mamie, for possibly the first time in her adult life, went visibly pink. Alfred watched his wife stand up and say a few words, gracious, modest, honest, exactly as she always was, and then sit back down beside him, and he leaned very slightly toward her and said, low enough for only her to hear, nicely done. She gave him the look she reserved for understatement. Harriet was excessive, she said. Harriet was right, he said. She pressed her lips together, fighting a smile. You are impossible, she informed him. You chose me, he said. The smile escaped. Yes, she said. Every day. James Winslow left for medical school in Galveston in the autumn of 1893, at 19 years old, tall, serious, red-haired, carrying a worn traveling bag and a list of books his mother had made him, and a handshake from his father that lasted considerably longer than handshakes usually do. Because Alfred Winslow was not a man who found it easy to put into a handshake all the things that he wanted to say to his son and chose, because words were not enough, to put into the grip of his hands instead. James went, and the house was different without him, and they adjusted, as families do, to the new shape of things. Ruth, at 10, promptly assumed James's habit of informing everyone around her of things they had not noticed and probably should have, with the addition of mathematical proofs when she felt they were applicable, which was more often than might be expected. Young Ezra, at 7, played the piano and chased the barn cats and talked to the horses and brought home every stray animal that crossed his path, which was a quality that Mamie addressed calmly each time it presented itself, and which she secretly found endearing in a way she did not entirely advertise. The years continued, and each one added its particulars to the story of the Winslow place and the people in it. Alfred's hair went gray at the temples, which Mamie said suited him considerably, and which he took no particular position on. Mamie's red hair stayed vivid well into her 30s, beginning only to quiet in her later years, which Alfred tracked with the same careful attention he had always paid to the things he loved. They grew into the life the way you grow into something made for you, not without friction, not without the ordinary wear of years, but with the growing sense that you are exactly the right shape for the thing you are in. The love between them became something that long-married people know and newlyweds cannot yet imagine, deeper than feeling, built into the architecture of daily life, expressed more often in a cup of coffee set at the right hand without being asked for than in any grand gesture. Though Alfred could still, on certain evenings, look at her across a room and feel the same arrested quality he had felt when he was 24 years old and walked into a doorframe because he was watching her instead of where he was going. She noticed sometimes when he looked at her that way. She always had. And she looked back, with the same clear, direct gaze that had undone him from the beginning, and he understood that she saw him just as fully, just as completely, and that being seen like that by a person like Mamie Fairchild Winslow was the greatest fortune he had ever come into. On their 15th wedding anniversary, a hot August evening in 1893, the year full of good things, Alfred came in from the corrals at sunset to find the table set with the good cloth, and a supper that smelled extraordinary and a lamp burning warm on the sideboard, and Mamie standing at the stove in her everyday dress with her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of flour on her forearm, entirely herself, entirely beautiful to him. 15 years, she said, when she heard him come in. 15 years, he agreed. He washed up at the basin and dried his hands and came to stand beside her at the stove. She looked sideways at him. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" "Tell me," he said. "The night you came," she said. "The look on your face when I opened the door, you were so," she smiled. "You were so determined. You had ridden 12 miles in the middle of the night and knocked on a woman's door at midnight, and you looked like a man who had made a decision and was prepared to stand by it regardless of the outcome." "That is exactly what I was," he said. She turned to look at him fully. "I think I knew then," she said. "Not the rest of it, not what would happen, but I knew that you were the kind of person who does not do things by halves. And I thought, this is a person I would like to know better." She paused. "Of course, then I had to be very sensible and practical about it because there was a great deal to sort out." "You were extraordinarily sensible," he said. "I am always sensible," she agreed. "It is one of my finer qualities." "It is," he said, "and also one of the qualities that occasionally drives me entirely out of my mind." She laughed that full, brilliant, unexpected laugh, exactly as it had been the first time he heard it in a barn door in the autumn of 1876, and he was still just as undone by it as he had ever been. 15 years, she said again, but differently this time, not as a count but as a kind of wonder. "And everything that comes next," he said. She turned back to the stove and stirred something that smelled of beef and herbs and the particular richness of a good supper, and he stood beside her in the warm kitchen with the evening light coming through the window and the sounds of the ranch outside and the knowledge, settled deep and unshakable, that this was the life and this was the person, and it had been worth every mile of that midnight ride and every day since and every day ahead. "Alfred," she said, "yes, I love you." He put his arm around her and kissed her temple, and she leaned into him just slightly, naturally, the way she did. "I know it," he said quietly. "I have known it a long time." "Good," she said. "Then we are both well informed." Outside, young Ezra was somewhere in the direction of the barn, and the piano would be played this evening. And somewhere between Galveston and the rest of his life, James Winslow was becoming a doctor, and Ruth Winslow was sitting at the kitchen table with a mathematics problem that she had set herself for her own satisfaction. And the stars would come out over the Texas land tonight the same way they always had, enormous and uncontainable. And Alfred Winslow stood in his kitchen with his wife, and felt the fullness of everything that a life could hold when it was lived with open hands and an honest heart, and the willingness to ride 12 miles in the dark, because someone deserved the chance to choose. Everything had come from that choice. Everything good, everything real, everything that mattered. It had all come from a single night when a man had decided that quiet was no longer enough and had saddled his horse and ridden toward the thing he loved. And Mamie Fairchild, who had always known her own mind but had needed someone to ask, had opened the door. And that, as they both agreed whenever they thought about it, which was often, had made all the difference in the world.